In the crowded hallways of Maplewood High, where lockers slammed shut and laughter echoed off tiled walls, 16-year-old Clara had always been the curious type. She wasn't the most popular girl in school, nor was she invisible, just someone who noticed things others didn't. Whether it was a misplaced pencil on the floor or a teacher's unusual mood, Clara paid attention to details. So when she opened her locker one ordinary afternoon and spotted something wedged between two textbooks, her curiosity immediately kicked into high gear. It wasn't hers. That much was certain. The folded piece of paper looked old, its edges slightly crumpled as though it had traveled through many hands before ending up here. Clara glanced around cautiously, wondering if anyone else might have seen it, but the hallway was chaotic. Students rushing to their next class, friends chatting loudly, and sneakers squeaking against the polished floors. No one seemed to care about what was happening at her locker. Carefully, she unfolded the note. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than random scribbles, strange symbols, numbers arranged in patterns, and what looked like coordinates written in faded ink. Clara tilted her head, studying it closely. It reminded her of those treasure maps she used to draw as a kid, except this felt real. There was something deliberate about the way everything was laid out, almost like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Her heart began to race. Who could have left this? And why in her locker? She thought back to earlier that day but couldn't recall seeing anyone suspicious near her things. Maybe it was meant for someone else, a mix-up, or perhaps someone wanted her to find it. The idea sent a shiver down her spine. What if this wasn't just some harmless prank? Clara tucked the note into her backpack, deciding not to show it to anyone. Not yet. Something told her this discovery was important, even if she didn't fully understand why. Over the years, she developed a knack for solving mysteries. Thanks to countless hours spent reading detective novels and watching crime shows. This felt like her chance to step into the role of a real-life sleuth. Later that evening, sitting cross-legged on her bedroom floor with a flashlight in hand, Clara pulled out an old cipher book from her shelf. Her grandfather had given it to her last summer during a family trip, saying it might come in handy someday. Little did he know how right he'd be. Flipping through the pages, she tried matching the symbols on the note to examples in the book. Slowly but surely, parts of the code started making sense. The coordinates pointed to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place everyone knew about but rarely visited. Excitement bubbled inside her chest. Was this some kind of scavenger hunt? A secret club initiation? Or something far more serious? Whatever it was, Clara couldn't resist finding out. Tomorrow, she decided, she would investigate further. For now, though, she hid the note under her mattress, feeling both thrilled and uneasy. After all, you never know what secrets lie beneath the surface, or who might be watching. The next morning, Clara woke up with a mix of excitement and nerves buzzing in her chest. She hadn't been able to sleep much, her mind racing over the mysterious note and what it might mean. Was it just some harmless prank, or was she about to stumble into something far bigger than herself? Either way, she couldn't ignore the pull of curiosity tugging at her. After getting ready for school, she slipped the note into her backpack, determined to follow the trail after classes ended. By lunchtime, Clara's thoughts were consumed by the coordinates on the paper. They pointed to an old warehouse near the edge of town, a place everyone called the Ghost Factory because no one had used it in years. Rumors swirled that it was haunted, but Clara didn't believe in ghosts. Still, the thought of going there alone made her stomach twist. What if someone saw her snooping around? Or worse, what if whoever left the note found out she'd taken it? After school, she waited until most students had cleared out before heading toward her bike. The ride to the warehouse felt longer than usual, each pedal stroke filling her with more doubt. When she finally arrived, the building loomed ahead like something out of a movie. Its broken windows stared back like hollow eyes, and weeds grew through cracks in the concrete foundation. Clara hesitated for a moment, gripping the handlebars tightly. But then she reminded herself why she was here, to uncover the truth. She parked her bike behind a cluster of bushes and crept closer, heart pounding. Peering through one of the shattered windows, she could see faint light flickering inside. Someone was definitely there. Voices drifted through the air, two men talking in low tones. Clara strained to listen, catching snippets of their conversation. One voice sounded angry, accusing the other of being careless. Then came the phrase that sent chills down her spine. "If they decode it, we're done for." Her breath caught in her throat. Decode what? Could they be talking about the note? Before she could think further, movement caught her eye. One of the men turned toward the window, his silhouette sharp against the dim light. Panicked, Clara ducked down, her pulse hammering in her ears. Had he seen her? She stayed crouched for what felt like forever, waiting for any sign of danger. When she finally dared to glance up again, both men were gone from view. Clara didn't stick around to find out where they went. Heart racing, she bolted back to her bike and pedaled away as fast as she could, not stopping until she reached the safety of her neighborhood. Back home, she locked her bedroom door and pulled out the note once more. Now everything felt different. This wasn't just some random puzzle. It was tied to something serious, maybe even dangerous. And those men, who were they? What did they want? As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across her room, Clara realized she couldn't do this alone. Whoever had left the note in her locker clearly knew something she didn't. And now, so did those men. She needed answers, but finding them meant taking risks she wasn't sure she was ready for. Yet deep down, she knew one thing for certain. Turning back wasn't an option anymore. The next day at school, Clara couldn't shake off the unease that had settled over her like a heavy blanket. Her mind kept replaying the events from the previous afternoon. The flickering lights in the abandoned warehouse, the hushed voices of the two men, and the chilling words about decoding something. She tried to focus on her classes, but every time she glanced at her backpack where the note was hidden, her thoughts spiraled back to the mystery. It was during lunch when things took an unexpected turn. As Clara sat alone at a corner table, picking at her sandwich without much appetite, she noticed someone approaching her. It was a boy she hadn't seen before, tall, with messy dark hair and sharp features that gave him an air of quiet intensity. He wasn't part of any group. Instead, he seemed to blend into the background, unnoticed by most students. Clara recognized him as Ethan, the new kid who had transferred to Maplewood High just last week. Ethan slid into the seat across from her without asking, his piercing gaze fixed on her face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a low voice, he said, "You've got something that belongs to me." His tone wasn't threatening, but there was an edge to it, a mix of urgency and caution that made Clara stiffen. "What are you talking about?" she asked, feigning ignorance. Her heart began to race. Did he know about the note? How could he possibly connect her to it? Ethan leaned closer, lowering his voice even more. "Don't play dumb. A piece of paper with symbols and coordinates. I need it back." Clara's stomach churned. So he did know. But how? And why did he want it so badly? She decided to test him. "Why should I believe you? For all I know, you could be one of the guys from the warehouse." For a split second, Ethan looked surprised, but then his expression hardened. "Warehouse? You went there? Are you insane?" He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in his movements. "Look, I don't have time for this. That note is important, not just to me, but to a lot of people, if it falls into the wrong hands." He trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished, but Clara understood the implication. This wasn't just some random puzzle or scavenger hunt. It was tied to something bigger, something dangerous. Still, she wasn't ready to trust him completely. Not yet. "Prove it," she challenged, crossing her arms. "If it's yours, tell me what it means." Ethan hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. Then, leaning in again, he whispered, "It's part of a code, a key to exposing corruption. People are watching, waiting. If they get their hands on it, Innocent lives will be at risk. His words sent a shiver down her spine. Could he be telling the truth? Or was this some elaborate trick to get the note back? Clara studied his face, searching for any sign of deceit. But all she saw was sincerity, and maybe a hint of desperation. Before she could respond, Ethan pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket and slid it across the table toward her. On it were similar symbols and numbers, though arranged differently. "This is another fragment," he explained. "There are more pieces out there. We need to find them before anyone else does." Clara stared at the second note, her mind racing. Everything he said sounded wild, almost unbelievable. But deep down, she felt a pull, a nagging sense that he was telling the truth. Still, trusting him wouldn't be easy. "We'll talk later," Ethan said abruptly, standing up. "Meet me after class. Alone." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of students. Clara watched him go, her thoughts swirling. Who was Ethan, really? And what had she gotten herself into? Whatever the answers were, one thing was clear. Her life was about to get a whole lot more complicated. After the final bell rang, signaling the end of another long school day, Clara lingered by her locker, her heart thumping in anticipation. She had spent most of the afternoon debating whether or not to meet Ethan behind the gymnasium, as he'd instructed. Part of her wanted to walk away from this strange situation altogether, to forget about the mysterious notes and the eerie encounter at the warehouse. But curiosity gnawed at her relentlessly. If Ethan was telling the truth, then ignoring him might mean letting something dangerous slip through her fingers. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her backpack and headed toward the meeting spot. The gymnasium was tucked away at the far edge of the campus, surrounded by tall oak trees that cast long shadows in the fading sunlight. As Clara approached, she spotted Ethan leaning against the brick wall, his arms crossed and his expression tense. He looked up as she neared, his sharp eyes scanning the area before settling on her. "You came," he said, sounding both relieved and surprised. "I wasn't sure you would." Clara shrugged, trying to appear calm despite the storm of questions swirling in her mind. "You didn't give me much choice. You show up out of nowhere, claim the note belongs to you, and start talking about codes and corruption. What am I supposed to think?" Ethan nodded slowly, acknowledging her skepticism. "Fair enough. Let me explain." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "The notes are part of a larger code, a digital key designed to expose illegal activities by a powerful organization. Think corrupt corporations, stolen data, blackmail, the works. These people operate in secret, pulling strings from behind the scenes. The code is their weak point, the one thing they can't afford to let fall into the wrong hands." Clara listened intently, her brow furrowed. It sounded like something straight out of a movie, but the intensity in Ethan's voice made it hard to dismiss. "And you're part of this?" she asked cautiously. "How do I know you're not working for them?" Ethan hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Because I used to work for them," he admitted finally, "but not anymore. When I realized what they were capable of, what they were planning, I left. Now I'm trying to stop them. That's why I need your help." His confession caught Clara off guard. She hadn't expected him to admit such a thing so openly. "Why should I trust you?" she pressed, her voice steady despite the unease bubbling inside her. "For all I know, this could be some trap." "I get it," Ethan replied, holding her gaze. "You don't have any reason to trust me. But here's the thing. If we don't act now, those pieces of the code will end up in their hands. And once that happens, there's no going back. Innocent people will get hurt, maybe even killed." His words hung heavy in the air between them. Clara felt torn. On one hand, walking away seemed safer, less risky. But on the other hand, the thought of doing nothing while someone else took control of the situation felt unbearable. She couldn't just stand by and let whatever was happening unfold without trying to make a difference. "Okay," she said finally, surprising even herself. "I'll help. but only because it sounds like the right thing to do, not because I fully trust you yet." A flicker of relief passed over Ethan's face. "That's all I ask, for now." He pulled out a crumpled map from his pocket and spread it on the ground. It was marked with several locations, each labeled with cryptic symbols similar to the ones on the notes. "These are the places where the remaining fragments of the code are hidden," he explained. "We'll need to retrieve them one by one, but we have to be careful. They're watching us, waiting for us to make a move." Clara studied the map, her pulse quickening. Each location represented another step deeper into this tangled web of secrets and danger. Yet, as daunting as it seemed, she couldn't deny the thrill coursing through her veins. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just an observer. She was part of something bigger than herself. "Where do we start?" she asked, looking up at Ethan. He pointed to a spot on the map, a quiet park on the outskirts of town. "Here, tomorrow evening. Come alone and don't tell anyone where you're going." As they parted ways, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that her decision to team up with Ethan would change everything. Whether for better or worse, she wasn't sure. But one thing was certain: her ordinary life was officially over. The following evening, Clara found herself standing at the edge of Willow Park, a quiet stretch of greenery tucked away on the outskirts of town. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, but Clara barely noticed the beauty around her. Her focus was entirely on the task ahead, and the weight of what she was about to do. She clutched the map Ethan had given her tightly in one hand, her fingers brushing against the faint pencil marks that marked their next destination. Ethan arrived moments later, his movements quick and deliberate. He nodded toward her as he approached, his expression serious. "Ready?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. They both knew there was no turning back now. Clara nodded, trying to steady her nerves. "Let's just get this over with." Together, they made their way deeper into the park, following the trail that led to an old gazebo surrounded by overgrown bushes. According to the map, one of the fragments of the code was hidden somewhere nearby. As they searched, Clara couldn't help but notice how alert Ethan seemed, his eyes darting constantly, scanning every shadow, every movement. It was clear he didn't trust their surroundings any more than she did. After several tense minutes, Ethan crouched down near the base of the gazebo and began digging through the dirt with his hands. Clara knelt beside him, helping to clear away leaves and debris until something shiny caught her eye. A small metal box buried just beneath the surface. Her heart skipped a beat as Ethan carefully pried it open, revealing another slip of paper inside. Success. But before either of them could celebrate, a sound shattered the silence. A twig snapping somewhere behind them. Both froze, exchanging a glance filled with alarm. Someone else was here. "Stay close," Ethan whispered urgently, grabbing Clara's arm and pulling her into the cover of the nearby trees. They moved quickly but quietly, weaving between trunks and staying low to avoid being seen. Peering cautiously through the foliage, Clara spotted two figures emerging from the shadows. Men dressed in dark clothes, their faces obscured by caps. One of them held a device that looked like a scanner, its blinking lights casting an eerie glow in the dimming light. "They're tracking us," Ethan murmured under his breath, his voice tight with frustration. "They must have figured out we'd come here." Clara's mind raced. How had they been so careless? Had someone tipped them off? Or was the organization always one step ahead? Before she could ask, Ethan grabbed her hand again and tugged her further into the woods. "We need to split up," he said firmly. "It'll confuse them, give us a better chance to escape. Meet me back at my place. Do you remember the address I gave you earlier?" She nodded, though panic clawed at her chest. Splitting up felt risky, but staying together might mean getting caught. Without another word, Ethan darted off in one direction, disappearing into the thickening darkness. Taking a deep breath, Clara turned and ran the opposite way, her sneakers crunching softly against the forest floor. Her heart pounded as she zigzagged through the trees, dodging branches and leaping over roots. Behind her, She could hear voices shouting, growing louder as the men closed in. Just when she thought she couldn't run anymore, she burst out of the woods and onto a quiet residential street. Gasping for air, she glanced over her shoulder to see if anyone had followed her, but the coast was clear. For now, she was safe. But as she hurried toward Ethan's house, clutching the precious fragment of the code in her pocket, she couldn't shake the feeling that danger was far from over. If anything, it was only getting closer. Clara reached Ethan's house just as the last traces of daylight faded, leaving the world cloaked in shadows. It was a modest place, small and unassuming, tucked at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. She hesitated for a moment on the porch, catching her breath and trying to steady her racing thoughts before knocking softly on the door. Ethan opened it almost immediately, his face pale but resolute. "You made it," he said, stepping aside to let her in. His voice carried a mix of relief and tension, mirroring the storm brewing inside Clara. Inside, the living room was sparse, with only a worn couch, a cluttered desk, and stacks of papers scattered across every available surface. A laptop sat open on the desk, its screen glowing faintly in the dim light. Clara noticed maps pinned to the walls, marked with red circles and arrows, clear signs that Ethan had been planning this operation for some time. "Did they follow you?" Ethan asked, closing the door behind her and locking it securely. Clara shook her head. "I don't think so." But they were close. Ethan nodded grimly, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "We can't stay here long. They'll figure out where I live sooner or later." As he spoke, Clara's eyes drifted to the stack of documents on the desk. Something about them caught her attention, a logo printed at the top of one page. It looked familiar, though she couldn't quite place it. Curiosity got the better of her, and she picked up the document, scanning its contents quickly. Her stomach dropped when she realized what she was reading. Detailed plans outlining illegal activities tied to the same organization Ethan claimed to be fighting against. But there was something else too, references to Ethan's name, along with dates and locations that suggested he'd once been deeply involved with them. Her heart sank. "You lied to me," she said quietly, her voice trembling with anger and betrayal. "You told me you left that group, but these papers say otherwise." Ethan froze, his expression shifting from shock to guilt. For a moment, he didn't respond, his gaze dropping to the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with regret. "It's not what it looks like," he began, stepping closer. "Yes, I worked for them. I won't deny that. But everything I did after I found out how corrupt they were, it was to bring them down. Those documents, they're evidence I've been collecting to expose them." Clara stared at him, torn between disbelief and the flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, he was telling the truth. "Why didn't you tell me all of this before?" she demanded. "How am I supposed to trust you if you keep secrets?" "I wanted to protect you." Ethan shot back, his frustration spilling over. "The less you knew, the safer you'd be. But now," he sighed, rubbing his temples, "now we're in too deep for half-truths. If we're going to finish this, you deserve to know everything." He explained how he'd infiltrated the organization years ago, gathering intel while pretending to play along with their schemes. At first, he thought he could change things from within. But the deeper he went, the more he realized how dangerous they truly were. That's when he decided to turn against them, using the fragments of the code as leverage to dismantle their operations entirely. Clara listened silently, her emotions warring within her. Part of her wanted to walk away, to leave Ethan and the whole mess behind, but another part couldn't ignore the fact that he'd risked everything to fight back. Whether or not she trusted him completely, she couldn't deny that they shared a common goal, stopping the organization before it caused even more harm. "Fine," she said finally, her tone firm. "I'll help you finish this. But no more lies, Ethan. Not even little ones." Relief washed over his face. "Thank you, Clara. You won't regret this." They spent the next hour poring over the map, plotting their next move. The final piece of the code was hidden in the organization's heavily guarded headquarters, a fortified building downtown. Breaking in would be nearly impossible, but they had no other choice. As they planned, Clara felt a strange sense of resolve settling over her. Whatever happened next, she was ready to face it head-on, even if it meant putting herself in greater danger than ever before. The night air was cold and damp as Clara and Ethan stood across the street from the towering building that housed the organization's headquarters. It loomed above them like a fortress, its windows dark except for a few faint glimmers of light on the upper floors. Security cameras perched at every corner, their lenses scanning the area methodically. Armed guards patrolled the entrance, their movements sharp and deliberate. "This is insane," Clara whispered, clutching the strap of her backpack tightly. "How are we supposed to get inside without getting caught?" Ethan glanced at her, his expression calm but intense. "We'll do exactly what we planned. Stick to the shadows, avoid the cameras, and move fast. If anything goes wrong, stick to the escape route I showed you." Clara nodded, though her stomach churned with nerves. She had never done anything remotely close to this before. Sneaking into an abandoned warehouse was one thing, but breaking into a high-security facility. This felt like stepping straight into a spy movie, except there were no stunt doubles or second chances. They waited until the patrol outside changed shifts, creating a brief window of opportunity. Dressed in dark clothes and wearing caps to conceal their faces, they darted across the street and slipped through a narrow alleyway that ran alongside the building. Ethan led the way, his movements precise and calculated. He carried a small device that emitted a soft beeping sound whenever they were approaching a camera's line of sight. Each time it beeped, they froze, pressing themselves flat against the wall until the coast was clear. When they reached a service door tucked away at the back of the building, Ethan pulled out a set of lock-picking tools. His hands moved quickly, expertly manipulating the tumblers until the lock clicked open. Clara held her breath, half expecting alarms to blare at any moment, but the only sound was the distant hum of traffic. Inside, the building was eerily quiet. The dim glow of emergency lights illuminated long corridors lined with doors, each marked with numbers and symbols. Ethan consulted the map briefly, then gestured for Clara to follow him down the hallway. Every step echoed loudly, making her wince. Her heart pounded so hard she was sure the guards could hear it. They finally reached the server room, a heavy metal door secured by a keypad. Ethan knelt in front of it, pulling out a small gadget he called a decoder. As it worked to crack the code, Clara kept watch, peering nervously around the corner. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Panic surged through her. "Someone's coming," she hissed. Ethan didn't look up. Almost got it. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by muffled voices. Clara's mind raced. Without thinking, she grabbed a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall and hurled it down the corridor. It clattered loudly, drawing the guards' attention away from their position. They shouted and ran toward the noise, giving Ethan just enough time to finish unlocking the door. "Go," he urged, pushing her inside. The server room was filled with rows of humming computers and blinking lights. Clara spotted the flash drive containing the final fragment of the code plugged into one of the machines. She yanked it free and shoved it into her pocket, adrenaline coursing through her veins. But their luck ran out moments later. Alarms blared, red lights flashing as the building erupted into chaos. Guards swarmed the hallway outside, shouting orders. Ethan slammed the door shut and used a chair to barricade it, buying them precious seconds. "We need to split up," he said urgently. "I'll hold them off. You take the code and get out of here." "No," Clara protested, panic rising in her chest. "I'm not leaving you." "You have to," Ethan insisted, his voice firm but tinged with emotion. "This isn't just about us anymore. Get the code to safety. That's all that matters now." Before she could argue further, he pushed her toward a ventilation shaft in the corner of the room. With trembling hands, Clara climbed inside, tears stinging her eyes as she crawled away. Behind her, she heard Ethan confronting the guards, his voice steady even as shouts and scuffles filled the air. As she emerged into the cool night, clutching the flash drive tightly, Clara realized the weight of what Ethan had done. He had sacrificed himself to ensure she completed the mission. Now it was up to her to make sure his bravery wasn't in vain. Clara's hands trembled as she sprinted through the deserted streets, her lungs burning with every breath. The flash drive felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in her pocket, its presence both a burden and a lifeline. She couldn't stop running. Not yet. Behind her, the distant wail of sirens grew louder, but she forced herself to focus on Ethan's instructions. Get to the safe house, upload the code, and expose the organization's secrets to the world. Her legs carried her to an old library on the edge of town, a place Ethan had mentioned during their planning sessions. It was abandoned now, its windows boarded up, and its walls covered in graffiti. Clara slipped inside through a broken side door, finding refuge in the dusty silence of the forgotten building. Using the laptop Ethan had given her earlier, she inserted the flash drive and began uploading the completed code to an encrypted server. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, her heart pounding as the progress bar inched forward. When the upload finished, Clara sent an anonymous tip to several news outlets and government agencies, attaching the files that would reveal the organization's illegal activities. As soon as she hit send, a wave of exhaustion washed over her. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, she allowed herself to sit down, leaning against the cold wall as tears streamed down her face. Ethan's sacrifice replayed in her mind, the way he'd stayed behind to give her a chance to escape. Had he made it out alive, or had he been captured, or worse? The next morning, the story broke everywhere. News channels buzzed with reports about the corruption scandal, naming high-profile individuals tied to the organization. Protests erupted outside corporate offices, and authorities launched investigations into the allegations. Clara watched it all unfold from her bedroom window, feeling a mix of pride and sorrow. They had done it. They had exposed the truth, but at what cost? A few days later, while sorting through some papers in her room, Clara found a letter tucked under her mattress. At first, she thought it was one of her own notes, but when she opened it, she recognized Ethan's handwriting immediately. Her chest tightened as she read. Clara, if you're reading this, it means things didn't go as planned. I wanted to say thank you for trusting me, for believing in something bigger than yourself, and for having the courage to see this through. You've always been stronger than you realize. Whatever happens next, don't stop fighting for what's right. The world needs more people like you. Tears blurred her vision as she folded the letter carefully and placed it back where she'd found it. There was no signature, no indication of whether Ethan had written it before or after their mission. But deep down, Clara knew he hadn't expected to make it out alive. His words were meant to guide her, to remind her why they had risked everything in the first place. In the weeks that followed, Clara threw herself into uncovering other hidden truths, determined to honor Ethan's memory. She started small, investigating local issues and sharing her findings online. Slowly but surely, she built a reputation as someone who wouldn't back down, no matter how powerful the opposition. People began reaching out to her, asking for help with their own battles against injustice. Though she never heard from Ethan again, Clara often thought about him. His quiet determination, his willingness to sacrifice everything for the greater good. He had taught her that even ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they stood up for what was right. And as long as there were secrets waiting to be uncovered, Clara vowed to keep searching, to keep shining a light in the darkest corners of the world. Because sometimes the smallest actions can spark the biggest changes, and Clara was ready to be that spark. Ask. Explain.